The autumn air in Fairview carried the familiar scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke as 16-year-old Brian Mercer jogged onto the practice field. October had always been his favorite month, not just because of football season, but because of the way the maple trees surrounding Fairview High School transformed into brilliant shades of gold and crimson. It was Wednesday, October 15th, 2003, and the Eagles were preparing for their homecoming game against the rival Westmont Warriors. "Mercer, you're 3 minutes late," Coach Tom Reynolds barked from the sideline, his breath visible in the crisp evening air. At 52, Reynolds was a fixture at Fairview High, having coached football for nearly 2 decades. His gruff exterior masked a deep care for his players, and Brian had become one of his favorites over the past 2 seasons. "Sorry, Coach, had to help Mrs. Patterson with her computer after school," Brian called back, pulling on his helmet. The junior running back had always been like that, willing to help anyone who needed it. Whether it was tutoring younger students in math or helping elderly neighbors with yard work, Brian Mercer was the kind of kid who made Fairview proud. The practice was intense but productive. The team ran through their playbook with precision, knowing that homecoming was just 3 days away. Brian's parents, David and Susan Mercer, watched from the bleachers as they did every Wednesday, cheering when their son broke through the defensive line during scrimmage. The family had moved to Fairview when Brian was in elementary school, drawn by the small-town atmosphere and excellent schools. David worked as an accountant for a local manufacturing company, while Susan taught 3rd grade at Fairview Elementary. By 7:30 p.m., practice had wrapped up. The team gathered in a circle for Coach Reynolds' final words. "Remember, gentlemen, homecoming isn't just about the game. It's about showing this community what we're made of. Get some rest, eat well, and I'll see you all tomorrow." Before I continue with Brian's story, I want to ask you, where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below and let me know what small town or city you call home. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to follow this case to its shocking conclusion. Now let's return to that fateful October evening in Fairview. As the players dispersed, Brian lingered in the locker room. He was always one of the last to leave, taking his time to properly clean his gear and organize his locker. His teammates had learned to expect this ritual. Brian was methodical about everything, from his homework to his workout routine. It was a trait that served him well both on the field and in the classroom, where he maintained a solid B+ average while taking advanced courses. "Need a ride home, Brian?" called out his best friend, Marcus Williams, as he headed toward the exit with several other players. "Nah, I'm good. Mum's picking me up at 8, Brian replied, checking his watch. "Go ahead without me." Marcus hesitated for a moment. "You sure? I can wait." "Really, I'm fine. See you tomorrow," Brian insisted with a smile that would haunt Marcus for years to come. The locker room gradually emptied until only Brian remained. Coach Reynolds was in his office, reviewing game footage and preparing for the next day's practice. Through the small window that connected his office to the locker room, he could see Brian methodically packing his backpack and organizing his space. At 7:55 p.m., Reynolds called out, "Don't forget to lock up when you leave, Brian." "Will do, Coach," came the familiar reply. Those would be the last words Coach Reynolds would ever hear Brian Mercer speak. At 8:15 p.m., Susan Mercer arrived at the school parking lot, surprised not to see her son waiting by the usual pickup spot near the gym entrance. She waited 5 minutes, then walked inside to look for him. The hallways were eerily quiet, lit only by emergency lighting that cast long shadows across the polished floors. She knocked on Coach Reynolds' office door. "Tom, is Brian still here?" Reynolds looked up from his playbook, confusion crossing his weathered face. "He should have left 20 minutes ago. Let me check the locker room." Together, they searched the empty locker room, calling Brian's name. His locker stood open, his street clothes still hanging inside, but his backpack and practice gear were gone. The coach checked the weight room, the gymnasium, and even the equipment storage area, but there was no sign of the teenager. "Maybe he got a ride with one of the other boys," Reynolds suggested, though something in his gut told him otherwise. Susan called David, who immediately left work and drove to the school. By 9 p.m. they had contacted Marcus and several other teammates, but no one had seen Brian after he declined Marcus's offer of a ride. The Mercers called the Fairview Police Department, speaking with Sergeant Janet Morrison, a 20-year veteran who had seen her share of missing teenager cases. "Most kids his age turn up within 24 hours, Morrison explained, though she could hear the genuine worry in Susan Mercer's voice. "They go to a friend's house, or sometimes there's just a miscommunication about pickup times. But I'll send an officer over to take a report and have a look around." Officer Mike Daniels arrived at the school 45 minutes later. He was thorough in his examination, noting the open locker, interviewing the Mercers and Coach Reynolds, and walking the school grounds with a flashlight. The October night had turned cold, with temperatures dropping into the low 40s, and a light mist had begun to fall. What struck Officer Daniels most was the condition of Brian's locker. Unlike the messy, cluttered lockers typical of teenage boys, Brian's was organized with almost military precision. His street clothes hung neatly, his textbooks were arranged by size, and there was even a small mirror and comb arranged on the top shelf. But his backpack was gone, along with his practice clothes and cleats. "Does Brian have a girlfriend?" Daniels asked. "Someone he might have gone to see?" "He dated Sarah Chen last year, but they broke up amicably over the summer," David Mercer replied. "He's been focused on football and keeping his grades up for college applications. He's hoping for a scholarship." As the evening stretched toward midnight, the reality began to set in. Brian Mercer, the responsible, reliable teenager who had never been in trouble, who called if he was going to be even 10 minutes late, was missing. And in a town where the biggest excitement was usually the annual Pumpkin Festival, the disappearance of Fairview High's star running back sent shockwaves through the community that would ripple for nearly 2 decades. Dawn broke grey and cold over Fairview on October 16, 2003. By 6 a.m., word of Brian Mercer's disappearance had spread through the tight-knit community with the speed that only small towns can achieve. The Fairview diner was buzzing with concerned voices, and phones rang constantly as neighbors called to offer help or share any information they might have. Detective Ray Hawkins was assigned to lead the investigation. At 38, Hawkins was the most experienced detective on Fairview's small police force, having transferred from Chicago 5 years earlier seeking a quieter life. He had handled missing person cases in the city, but nothing had prepared him for the intensity of emotion that a disappearance could generate in a community where everyone knew everyone. "Mrs. Mercer, I need you to think carefully," Hawkins said, sitting across from Susan and David in their living room on Elm Street. The house was modest but well-maintained, with family photos covering the mantel and Brian's football trophies displayed prominently on a bookshelf. Did Brian mention anything unusual in the days leading up to his disappearance? Anyone new he'd met? Any problems at school or with other kids? Susan shook her head, tears threatening to spill over. She hadn't slept since realizing Brian was missing, and the lack of rest was showing in her pale complexion and trembling hands. He was excited about homecoming. He'd been working extra hard in practice because Coach Reynolds was considering him for team captain next year. Brian is such a good kid, Detective. He volunteers at the animal shelter on weekends, helps his grandmother with her groceries every Sunday after church. David sat rigidly beside his wife, his jaw clenched with barely controlled emotion. "Detective, my son has never been in any kind of trouble. Not even a detention slip. He doesn't drink, doesn't do drugs. Hell, he won't even jaywalk because he says it sets a bad example for younger kids." Hawkins made notes as they talked, building a picture of a teenager who seemed almost too good to be true. But his experience had taught him that even the best kids could find themselves in dangerous situations through no fault of their own. The search began in earnest that morning. Coach Reynolds had called an emergency meeting of the football team at 7 a.m., and by 8 a.m., nearly 200 volunteers had gathered in the school parking lot. The group included students, parents, teachers, local business owners, and residents from across Fairview. Principal Margaret Hayes coordinated with the police to organize search parties, while the local fire department provided maps of the area surrounding the school. "We'll work in grids," Sergeant Morrison announced to the assembled crowd. "Each team gets a section to search thoroughly. We're looking for any sign of Brian, clothing, his backpack, anything that seems out of place. And remember, if you find something, don't touch it. Call the police immediately." Marcus Williams stood with his teammates, fighting back tears. "This is all wrong," he told his friend Jake Porter. "I should have waited for him. I should have made sure he got his ride." "Don't do that to yourself," Jake replied, though he was struggling with his own guilt. "You offered. He said no. You couldn't have known." The search parties spread out across Fairview like ripples in a pond. Some headed toward Miller's Woods, the dense forest preserve that bordered the school property. Others combed through the residential neighborhoods, checking garages, storage sheds, and any place a teenager might seek shelter. A third group searched along Willow Creek, the winding waterway that ran through the center of town. By midday, the temperature had risen into the 50s, but the October sun remained hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds that seemed to mirror the town's mood. Local news crews from the county seat had arrived, setting up their equipment on the school lawn and interviewing anyone willing to speak about Brian. "He's just the kind of kid every parent hopes to raise," said Ellen Kowalski, Brian's sophomore-year English teacher. "Polite, hard-working, always willing to help a classmate who was struggling. When he didn't show up for first period this morning, I knew immediately something was terribly wrong." Detective Hawkins spent the morning interviewing Brian's teammates and friends, looking for any detail that might provide a lead. The interviews painted a consistent picture of a well-liked, responsible teenager with no enemies and no apparent reason to run away. "Brian was talking about college scholarships constantly," explained Tommy Rodriguez, a senior linebacker. "He had his whole future planned out. He wanted to study business, maybe come back and help his dad's accounting firm grow. Running away? No way. Something happened to him." The most revealing interview came from Sarah Chen, Brian's ex-girlfriend. The petite senior with long black hair and kind eyes met with Hawkins in the school counselor's office, away from the chaos in the parking lot. "People keep asking if we had problems, if he was upset about the breakup," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "But it wasn't like that. We dated for 6 months, realized we were better as friends, and ended it. No drama, no hard feelings. Brian even helped me study for my SATs last month." "Did he mention anyone bothering him? Any problems with other students, adults, anyone?" Hawkins pressed. Sarah considered the question carefully. "There was one thing, but it was probably nothing. A few weeks ago, Brian said he thought someone had been in his locker. Some of his things were moved around. But you know how Brian is about organization. He notices everything. It could have been the janitor, or maybe another student grabbed the wrong locker by mistake." And this was the first potentially significant detail Hawkins had uncovered. He made a note to examine Brian's locker more thoroughly and to speak with the custodial staff. As the afternoon wore on, the search parties began returning with heavy hearts and empty hands. Miller's Woods had been combed thoroughly, with search and rescue volunteers even bringing in dogs to track any scent. The residential areas had yielded nothing, and the creek search had been equally fruitless. At 4 p.m., Hawkins called a press conference in the school auditorium. Local reporters filled the first few rows, while Brian's family and friends occupied the seats behind them. The detective's expression was grim as he stepped to the podium. "We have not yet located Brian Mercer," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "However, I want to assure the community that this investigation is being pursued with all available resources. We are treating this as a missing person case, with potential foul play involved." The words foul play sent a collective shudder through the audience. Until that moment, many people had clung to hope that Brian had simply gotten confused about pickup arrangements or had experienced some minor mishap. We are asking anyone who may have seen Brian after 7:30 p.m. yesterday evening to contact the Fairview Police Department immediately. We're also interested in speaking with anyone who may have noticed unusual activity around the high school or in the surrounding area. After the press conference, Coach Reynolds found himself alone in his office, staring at the game footage he had been reviewing when Brian disappeared. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was watching his missing player run touchdown after touchdown, full of life and promise, while somewhere in the real world, that same young man was in unknown danger. Reynolds had coached hundreds of players over his career, but Brian had been special, not just because of his athletic ability, but because of his character. The kid who always stayed after practice to help put away equipment, who never complained about extra conditioning, who treated the younger players with respect and encouragement. The coach's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone to call his wife. How do you tell the woman you love that you might have failed to protect a kid who trusted you? How do you live with the knowledge that the last words you spoke to someone might have been, "Don't forget to lock up"? As Thursday evening fell over Fairview, the community settled into an uneasy vigil. Porch lights burned throughout the night, and many residents found themselves unable to sleep, wondering what had happened to the town's golden boy. The homecoming game, scheduled for Saturday, seemed insignificant now. Nothing would be the same until Brian Mercer came home. But as the hours stretched into a second full day, that hope was beginning to feel more fragile with each passing moment. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp, clear October day that Brian Mercer would have loved. The autumn sunshine illuminated the changing leaves with brilliant intensity, creating a stark contrast to the dark mood that had settled over Fairview. Detective Ray Hawkins stood in the school parking lot at 6 a.m., nursing his third cup of coffee and reviewing the case file that was growing thicker by the hour. 2 days had passed since Brian's disappearance, and despite extensive searches and interviews, they had no solid leads. The state police had been called in to assist, bringing with them additional resources and expertise. A command center had been established in the school's library, with phones ringing constantly as tips poured in from across the region. "Detective," Officer Mike Daniels approached with a manila folder in his hand, "I've got the results from the interviews with the custodial staff. You're going to want to see this." Hawkins opened the folder and read the typed report from Gary Fletcher, the evening custodian who had been working the night Brian disappeared. Fletcher, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, had provided a timeline that caught the detective's attention. According to Fletcher's statement, he had begun his cleaning routine in the main building at 8:30 p.m., working his way toward the gymnasium complex. At approximately 9:15 p.m., he noticed that the lights were still on in the boys' locker room, which was unusual since practice typically ended well before then. When he went to investigate, he found the room empty, but noticed that locker 247, Brian's locker, was standing open. "Did you see Brian leave the building?" Hawkins had asked during the interview. "No, sir," Fletcher replied, "but that don't mean much. There's 4 different exits from that part of the building, and I was working in the main hallway most of the time. Kid could have left through the side door by the gym or the back exit by the weight room. Wouldn't have seen him from where I was." What made this information particularly interesting was the timing. If Fletcher's recollection was accurate, Brian's locker had been open at 9:15 p.m., more than an hour after practice ended and 15 minutes after his mother had arrived to pick him up. This suggested that either Brian had returned to his locker for some reason, or someone else had opened it. Hawkins made a decision that would prove crucial to the investigation. he ordered a complete forensic examination of locker 247 and the surrounding area. The State Crime Lab sent a team to process the scene, dusting for fingerprints, collecting fiber samples, and photographing every inch of the space. While the forensic team worked, Hawkins expanded his investigation beyond the school grounds. He had learned from experience that missing person cases often involved seemingly unrelated events that took on significance when viewed as part of a larger pattern. He began reaching out to law enforcement agencies in surrounding counties, looking for similar cases or any unusual activity that might be connected to Brian's disappearance. What he found made his blood run cold. In the past 18 months, 3 teenage boys had gone missing from small towns within a 100-mile radius of Fairview. Tyler Jameson, 16, had disappeared from Millbrook after basketball practice in March 2002. Kevin Shaw, 15, had vanished from Riverside following a track meet in August 2002. Most recently, Danny Costello, 17, had gone missing from Pine Valley after football practice just 6 weeks earlier, in September 2003. The similarities were striking. All 4 boys were athletes, all had disappeared after evening practices or meets, and all came from small rural communities. None had any history of running away or getting into trouble. Most disturbing of all, none had ever been found. "We might be looking at a serial predator," Hawkins told Sergeant Morrison during an emergency briefing. "Someone who's targeting teenage male athletes in small towns across this part of the state." The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation team. What had begun as a local missing person case was now potentially connected to a much larger and more sinister pattern. The FBI was contacted, and by Friday afternoon, Special Agent Patricia Kim had arrived in Fairview to assist with the case. Agent Kim was in her early 40s, with short black hair and intense brown eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. She had spent 12 years with the Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit, specializing in cases involving missing children and adolescents. Her presence brought both expertise and a sobering reality to the investigation. "If we are dealing with a serial offender, time is critical," Agent Kim explained to the assembled task force. "The first 72 hours are crucial in any missing person case, but when we're potentially dealing with an abduction, every minute counts." The agent's words weighed heavily on everyone present, particularly Coach Reynolds, who had been struggling with guilt since Brian's disappearance. The coach had been interviewed multiple times, and while he was clearly not a suspect, his emotional state was deteriorating. "I should have walked him to his car," Reynolds told Agent Kim during their interview. "I always told the boys to use the buddy system, never to walk alone at night, but Brian seemed so responsible, so capable. I never imagined—" "Coach, you can't blame yourself," Kim replied gently. "Predators are skilled at identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities. If someone was targeting Brian specifically, they would have found an opportunity, regardless of the precautions you took." The forensic examination of Brian's locker yielded some interesting results. While most of the fingerprints belonged to Brian himself, investigators found several partial prints that didn't match anyone in the school's database. More significantly, they discovered a small fiber caught on the inside edge of the locker door, a dark blue cotton fiber that didn't match any of Brian's clothing or equipment. Agent Kim studied the evidence with the methodical approach that had made her reputation in the Bureau. "This fiber suggests that someone other than Brian accessed this locker," she concluded. "Either Brian wasn't alone when he left, or someone came back later to remove something from his locker." As Friday evening approached, the community of Fairview prepared for what would have been homecoming night. The game had been postponed indefinitely, with the school board deciding that any celebration would be inappropriate while one of their students remained missing. Instead, a candlelight vigil was planned for Saturday evening in the town square. Brian's parents had aged visibly in the 3 days since their son's disappearance. Susan Mercer had taken leave from her teaching position, unable to focus on anything except finding her son. David had closed his accounting office, spending his days either at the command center or driving the streets of Fairview and neighboring towns, showing Brian's photograph to anyone who would look. "We just want him home," Susan told the gathered reporters at Friday's press conference. "Brian, if you can hear this, we love you. We just want you to come home safely. No questions asked." David stood beside his wife, his arm around her shoulders as she spoke. His eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep and constant worry. "To anyone who might have information," he added, his voice cracking slightly, "please, we're begging you. This is our son. He's just a kid. He doesn't deserve this." The raw emotion in the parents' pleas affected everyone present. Several reporters wiped away tears as they filed their stories, and the footage would be broadcast across the state, generating hundreds of new tips and leads for investigators to pursue. But as Friday turned into Saturday and Saturday into Sunday, those leads began to dwindle. Despite the massive search effort, the media attention, and the involvement of state and federal authorities, Brian Mercer remained missing. The vibrant, promising teenager who had jogged onto the practice field just 4 days earlier seemed to have vanished into thin air. The investigation continued, but with each passing day, the likelihood of finding Brian alive diminished. Agent Kim had seen too many cases like this one, and while she maintained a professional optimism for the sake of the family and community, privately she was preparing for a much darker outcome. In the days that followed, Fairview began to change. Parents started driving their children to and from school activities. The once trusting community installed new security systems and began locking doors that had remained open for generations. The innocence that had defined this small town was evaporating, replaced by a wariness and fear that would linger for years to come. Coach Reynolds made a decision that surprised many who knew him. He announced that he would be retiring from coaching at the end of the school year. "I can't do this anymore," he told Principal Hayes. "Every time I look at these kids, I see Brian. Every practice, I'm waiting for something terrible to happen. They deserve a coach who can focus on helping them succeed, not one who's paralyzed by what might go wrong." As October turned to November and November into December, the active search for Brian Mercer gradually wound down. The command center was dismantled, the state police returned to their regular duties, and Agent Kim was reassigned to other cases. But Detective Hawkins refused to let the case go cold. He continued to follow up on leads, to review the evidence, and to hope that somewhere, somehow, Brian Mercer was still alive and would find his way home. What none of them could have imagined was that the answer to Brian's disappearance was hidden just yards from where they had searched so intensively, waiting in darkness for 18 long years. The calendar on Detective Ray Hawkins' desk read, March 15th, 2009, 5.5 years since Brian Mercer had vanished from Fairview High School. The missing person poster that hung on the wall behind Hawkins' desk had faded slightly, but Brian's smiling face still watched over the detective's daily work like a silent reminder of the case that had changed everything. Hawkins had been promoted to Chief of Police 2 years earlier, a recognition of his dedication to the community and his professional competence. But privately, he considered the Brian Mercer case his greatest failure. Despite thousands of hours of investigation, hundreds of interviews, and dozens of potential leads, they were no closer to solving the mystery than they had been on that first terrible morning. The other similar cases, Tyler Jameson, Kevin Shaw, and Danny Costello, remained equally unsolved. What had initially appeared to be the work of a serial predator had yielded no concrete evidence linking the disappearances. The FBI had eventually classified the cases as inactive, meaning they were still open, but no longer receiving active investigation unless new evidence emerged. For the families involved, Inactive was a devastating designation. Susan and David Mercer had never stopped searching for their son. Their house on Elm Street had become an unofficial headquarters for missing children advocacy, with Susan coordinating with families across the state who faced similar tragedies. The bright, cheerful woman who had once taught third graders had transformed into a fierce advocate, testifying before state legislators about the need for better resources for missing person investigations. David had sold his accounting practice in 2007, using the proceeds to fund a private investigation into Brian's disappearance. He had hired ex-FBI agents, consulted with psychics despite his skepticism, and even traveled to other states to investigate potential sightings that invariably led nowhere. The search had consumed not just their savings, but their marriage as well. The Mercers had divorced in 2008, though they remained united in their determination to find their son. "We just grieve differently," Susan had explained to a local reporter. David needed to keep searching actively, traveling, following every lead. "I needed to focus on helping other families while staying close to home in case Brian came back. Neither of us was wrong, but we couldn't help each other anymore." The impact on Fairview had been profound and lasting. The small town that had once prided itself on its safety and close-knit community had never fully recovered from Brian's disappearance. Property values had declined as families moved away, seeking places where their children might be safer. The high school football program, once a source of tremendous community pride, struggled to maintain interest and participation. Coach Reynolds had indeed retired at the end of the 2003-2004 school year, as he had promised. His replacement, Coach Martinez from the county seat, was competent but never developed the deep connection with players and community that Reynolds had fostered over his 20-year career. The magic of Friday night football in Fairview had dimmed considerably. Reynolds himself had moved to Florida in 2006, seeking a fresh start and warmer weather for his retirement. But even in his new home, he found himself thinking about Brian Mercer almost daily. He had started a small scholarship fund in Brian's name, providing money for disadvantaged student athletes to attend summer football camps. It was his way of honoring the young man whose disappearance had effectively ended his coaching career. The high school had undergone significant changes in response to Brian's disappearance. A comprehensive security system had been installed, including cameras in all hallways and common areas. No student was allowed to remain on campus after activities without direct adult supervision, and a strict buddy system had been implemented for all athletic programs. Principal Hayes, now in her final year before retirement, often reflected on how one night had changed everything. "Brian Mercer was the kind of student every educator hopes to teach," she told new faculty members during orientation sessions. "His disappearance reminded us that evil can touch even the most innocent lives, even in places we think are safe." Marcus Williams had graduated in 2005 and gone on to college, but he never forgot the guilt he carried about not waiting for his friend that October night. He had become a teacher himself, working in an inner-city school where he coached basketball and mentored at-risk youth. His colleagues knew he had lost a close friend in high school, but Marcus rarely spoke about the details. "I tell my kids to look out for each other," Marcus would say. "You never know when a moment of carelessness or selfishness might change everything. We have to take care of our own." Sarah Chen had also been deeply affected by Brian's disappearance. She had gone on to study psychology in college, ultimately earning a master's degree in counseling with a specialization in trauma. She worked for a non-profit organization that provided support services to families of missing persons, directly inspired by her experience with the Mercer case. "Brian's disappearance taught me that terrible things can happen to anyone at any time," Sarah reflected during a 2010 interview for a documentary about missing persons. "But it also taught me that communities can come together in powerful ways, and that there's always hope, even when everything seems dark. The media attention on Brian's case had gradually faded over the years, though it never completely disappeared. Every October 15th, local news stations would run anniversary stories showing aged progression photos of what Brian might look like as a young adult. The images showed a handsome young man with kind eyes, someone who might be working his first job, attending college, or perhaps starting a family of his own. Detective Hawkins, now Chief Hawkins, had kept every piece of evidence from the case, stored in carefully labeled boxes in a locked evidence room. Periodically, he would review the files, looking for some detail that might have been overlooked, some connection that hadn't been made. The case had taught him that police work was often about persistence as much as inspiration, about refusing to give up, even when all logical leads had been exhausted. In 2015, advances in DNA technology prompted a re-examination of the evidence from Brian's locker. The mysterious blue fiber was subjected to new tests that could potentially identify not just the material, but the specific manufacturer and even the batch number. Unfortunately, the results showed only that the fiber came from a common cotton blend used in thousands of different garments. It was evidence, but not the breakthrough they had hoped for. The 10th anniversary of Brian's disappearance in 2013 had brought renewed media attention and a fresh wave of tips from the public. Chief Hawkins had assigned Detective Lisa Park, a young investigator who had joined the force specifically because she wanted to work on the Mercer case, to follow up on every lead. Park had reviewed the entire case file from beginning to end, interviewed key witnesses again, and even traveled to other jurisdictions to investigate potential connections to similar cases. "I've studied this case more than any other," Detective Park told Chief Hawkins during one of their regular review sessions. "I feel like I know Brian Mercer personally, even though I never met him. But I have to admit, Chief, I'm starting to think we might never find out what happened to him." Hawkins understood her frustration, having felt it himself many times over the years. "The day we stop looking is the day we fail that kid and his family," he replied. "As long as I'm wearing this badge, the Brian Mercer case stays active." Oh. But as 2020 arrived and the case approached its 17th anniversary, even Chief Hawkins was beginning to acknowledge that they might never have answers. The COVID-19 pandemic had shifted resources and attention to more immediate concerns, and the Brian Mercer investigation had been effectively shelved, though it technically remained open. It was during this period of seeming hopelessness that fate began to set in motion the events that would finally bring answers to Fairview. The old high school building, constructed in the 1960s, had been showing its age for years. Maintenance costs were escalating, and enrollment had declined significantly as families continued to move away from the area. The school board made a difficult decision. They would construct a new, smaller facility and demolish the old building that held so many memories, both wonderful and terrible. The demolition was scheduled for the summer of 2021, giving the community time to prepare for the loss of a landmark that had defined Fairview for over half a century. For Coach Tom Reynolds, now 70 years old and living quietly in Florida, the news brought a mixture of sadness and something else, a feeling he couldn't quite identify, but that seemed to whisper that this final chapter in the school's history might hold answers that had been hidden for far too long. In May of 2021, Reynolds made a decision that surprised his wife and adult children. He announced that he was taking a trip back to Fairview to see the old school one last time before it was torn down. He didn't fully understand why this felt so important, but the pull was undeniable. Something was calling him back to the place where his coaching career had ended and where a promising young man had vanished into mystery. What he would find there would change everything. The drive from Tampa to Fairview took Tom Reynolds 12 hours, with stops for gas and meals at roadside diners that reminded him of simpler times. It was May 23rd, 2021, and the 70-year-old former coach felt every mile in his arthritic joints. His wife, Helen, had tried to talk him out of the trip, worried about his health and his emotional state, but Reynolds had been adamant. "I need to see it one more time before they tear it down," he had told her. "I spent 20 years of my life in that building. I can't let them destroy it without saying goodbye." But deep down, Reynolds knew his motivation was more complex. For 18 years, he had carried the weight of Brian Mercer's disappearance like a stone in his chest. He had replayed that last evening hundreds of times, wondering if there was something he could have done differently, some sign he had missed. The nightmares had faded over the years, but they never completely disappeared. Fairview looked smaller than he remembered as he drove down Main Street in his rental car. Several storefronts stood empty, victims of economic decline and population loss. The Fairview diner was still operating, though it looked shabby compared to his memories. Miller's Hardware had closed, replaced by a dollar general store. The town that had once bustled with activity on a Sunday afternoon now felt almost deserted. Fairview High School sat on its familiar hill overlooking the town, but the building showed clear signs of neglect. Windows were boarded up, weeds grew through cracks in the parking lot, and graffiti marred the brick walls that had once been pristine. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, with warning signs about trespassing and asbestos hazards. Reynolds parked across the street and sat in his car for several minutes, overwhelmed by memories. He could almost see his players running wind sprints on the practice field, hear the sound of shoulder pads colliding during scrimmage, feel the excitement of Friday night games under the lights. And always, threading through these memories, was the image of Brian Mercer, earnest, hard-working Brian, who had trusted his coach to keep him safe. The demolition crew had been working for several days, Reynolds could see. Part of the main building's roof had been removed and a large dumpster overflowed with debris. Construction equipment sat idle in the afternoon heat, their operators having knocked off early for the weekend. Reynolds had expected the school to be completely secured, but he noticed that a section of the fence near the gymnasium had been damaged, creating a gap just large enough for a determined person to squeeze through. He looked around to make sure no one was watching, then made his way to the opening. The interior of the school was a maze of shadows and dust. Emergency lighting provided minimal illumination, casting eerie shadows across familiar hallways. Reynolds made his way slowly toward the athletic complex, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The trophy cases had been emptied, their contents presumably moved to the new school building, leaving only ghostly outlines on the walls. The gymnasium was largely intact, though the bleachers had been removed and stacked in the center of the floor. Reynolds stood at the free-throw line and remembered the pep rallies, the homecoming assemblies, the graduation ceremonies that had taken place in this space. So much life had happened here, so much joy and achievement and community pride. But it was the locker room that drew him like a magnet. He pushed through the heavy doors and found himself in the space that had haunted his dreams for nearly 2 decades. The lockers were all empty now, their doors hanging open like mouths, frozen in silent screams. The fluorescent lights had been removed, leaving the room lit only by the pale afternoon sun filtering through high, dirty windows. Reynolds walked slowly down the main aisle, remembering where each of his players had kept their equipment. Tommy Rodriguez had been in locker 15, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. Marcus Williams had claimed locker 32, decorated with pictures of NFL stars he hoped to emulate someday. And there, at the end of the third row, was locker 247, Brian Mercer's locker. The coach stood before the empty metal compartment, fighting back tears. This was where it had all ended, where a promising young life had intersected with evil and disappeared forever. He reached out and touched the cold metal, wondering what secrets this space might have witnessed. It was then that he noticed something odd. The back wall of Brian's locker appeared to be slightly different from the others. While most of the lockers had solid metal backs, this one seemed to have a slight gap along the bottom edge. Reynolds bent down for a closer look, his 60-year-old knees protesting the movement. What he saw made his heart race. The bottom of the locker's back wall was not flush with the floor as it should have been. Instead, there was a gap of perhaps half an inch, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. More importantly, the metal showed signs of having been moved or adjusted. Reynolds felt around the edges of the back panel and discovered that it was loose. With some effort, he was able to slide the metal sheet aside, revealing a hidden space behind the locker, a space between the locker room wall and an outer structural wall that created a narrow, dark cavity. His hands shaking with anticipation and dread, Reynolds used his phone's flashlight to peer into the hidden compartment. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Crammed into the narrow space was a backpack, faded and dusty, but still recognizable as the blue and white pack that Brian Mercer had carried every day to school. Next to it was a pair of cleats, the distinctive red and black Nike shoes that Brian had been so proud of when his parents bought them at the beginning of his junior year. But it was the notebook that made Reynolds' blood run cold. Partially hidden beneath the backpack was a small spiral notebook, its cover stained and warped, but still legible. In Brian's careful handwriting, barely visible in the dim light, were the words, "Practice Notes, Junior Year." Reynolds' hands were trembling so violently that he could barely hold his phone steady as he called 911. When the dispatcher answered, he could barely speak through his shock and emotion. "This is Tom Reynolds," he managed. "I'm at the old Fairview High School. I need you to send Chief Hawkins immediately. I've found Brian Mercer's things." Within 20 minutes, the abandoned school was swarming with police officers, crime scene technicians, and emergency personnel. Chief Hawkins, now 56 and showing grey at his temples, arrived with a combination of hope and dread that his officers recognized from previous developments in the case. "Tom," Hawkins said, grasping the former coach's shoulder, "tell me exactly what happened." Reynolds, still shaking from the discovery, walked Hawkins through his exploration of the building and his decision to examine Brian's locker more closely. "Ray, I don't know why I noticed it," he said. "Maybe it was just being in that space again, thinking about Brian, but something told me to look closer." The crime scene team worked methodically to extract the items from the hidden compartment. In addition to the backpack, cleats, and notebook, they found several pieces of clothing that appeared to match what Brian had been wearing on the night he disappeared. Most significantly, they discovered what appeared to be a cell phone, primitive by 2021 standards, but cutting-edge technology in 2003. Detective Lisa Park, now a seasoned investigator who had spent 8 years working the Mercer case, carefully photographed each item as it was removed. "Chief," she called over to Hawkins, "there's something else in here. Looks like papers, documents of some kind." The documents would prove to be the key to solving the 18-year mystery. Carefully preserved in plastic bags that someone had hidden with the other items, they contained information that would shock the Fairview community to its core and finally provide answers to the questions that had tormented so many for so long. As word spread through Fairview that Brian Mercer's belongings had been found, crowds began gathering outside the school. Susan Mercer, now 54, and working as a victim's advocate in the state capitol, received the call from Chief Hawkins while she was in a meeting. She dropped everything and made the 3-hour drive to Fairview, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror about what the discovery might mean. David Mercer, living in Arizona and working as a security consultant, boarded the first available flight back to the town he had left in despair years earlier. Marcus Williams, now a high school principal himself, cancelled his evening plans and drove 2 hours from his current home to be present for whatever revelations were coming. As the sun set over Fairview on May 23, 2021, the community braced itself for answers that had been 18 years in coming. The discovery in Locker 247 would not bring Brian Mercer home, but it would finally reveal the truth about what had happened to the golden boy who had vanished one October evening, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. The nightmare was far from over, but at least now they would finally understand what they were dealing with. The Fairview Police Department had never seen activity like what erupted following the discovery in Brian Mercer's locker. By the evening of May 23, 2021, FBI agents were flying in from multiple field offices. The State Crime Laboratory had deployed their most experienced technicians, and media crews from across the region were setting up camp outside the police station. Chief Ray Hawkins had established a command center in the high school auditorium, the same space where he had given so many frustrating press conferences over the years. But this time felt different. This time, they finally had evidence, real, tangible proof that might lead to answers. The analysis of Brian's belongings began immediately. The backpack contained exactly what you would expect from a conscientious student-athlete: textbooks, homework assignments, a water bottle, and energy bars. But it was the condition of these items that told a story. Everything was neatly arranged, showing no signs of struggle or hasty packing. Brian had organized his belongings with his typical care, suggesting that whatever had happened to him had not involved a violent confrontation at his locker. The cell phone, a basic flip model that was state-of-the-art in 2003, still held a partial charge after 18 years, a testament to the dry conditions in the hidden compartment. FBI technicians were able to extract data from the device, including text messages and call records that had never been previously available to investigators. But it was the documents, those carefully preserved papers found with Brian's belongings, that would finally crack the case wide open. Detective Lisa Park was the first to examine the contents of the plastic bags. What she found defied every assumption investigators had made about Brian's disappearance. The papers included handwritten notes, photocopied documents, and what appeared to be surveillance records tracking the movements of several adults in the Fairview community. "Chief," Park called across the crowded command center, her voice tight with excitement and disbelief, "you need to see this immediately." The documents revealed that Brian Mercer had been conducting his own investigation in the weeks before his disappearance. The meticulous teenager who organized his locker with military precision had been tracking what he believed was a theft ring operating within the school system. His notes detailed missing equipment, unauthorized use of school credit cards, and forged purchase orders that had been diverting thousands of dollars from school accounts. But the most shocking revelation was the identity of the person Brian suspected of masterminding the scheme: Gary Fletcher, the night custodian who had been one of the last people to see Brian alive. Brian's investigation had been remarkably thorough for a 16-year-old. He had documented patterns of missing equipment that coincided with Fletcher's work schedule, photographed receipts he had found in waste baskets, and even recorded serial numbers of items that later appeared for sale on online auction sites. The teenager had been building a case, preparing to present his evidence to school administrators. What Brian couldn't have known was that Fletcher had become aware of the investigation. The custodian had noticed the teenager staying late after practices, sometimes returning to areas of the building during evening hours when he should have been long gone. Fletcher had begun watching Brian, eventually discovering that the student was documenting his activities. The final entries in Brian's notebook, dated just 2 days before his disappearance, revealed his growing concern that he was being watched. "GF keeps showing up wherever I am in the building," Brian had written. "Think he knows I'm on to him. Need to get this information to Principal Hayes soon. FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who had flown in from the Bureau's headquarters in Quantico, studied Brian's notes with the expertise that came from decades of criminal psychology. Brian Mercer was incredibly brave, she told the assembled investigators, but he was also naive about the danger he was putting himself in. He was dealing with someone who had everything to lose if his crimes were exposed. The investigation into Gary Fletcher began immediately, but what they discovered complicated the case even further. Fletcher had died of a heart attack in 2015, taking his secrets to the grave. His modest home had been sold years earlier, and most of his possessions had been donated to charity. Any physical evidence of his crimes or of what had happened to Brian seemed to have vanished along with the man himself. But Detective Park refused to give up. She began reconstructing Fletcher's life, interviewing his former neighbors, his few remaining relatives, and anyone who might have information about his activities during 2003. What emerged was a picture of a man struggling with financial problems, gambling debts, and a growing desperation that had led him to steal from his employer. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Fletcher's nephew, Robert Fletcher, had been cleaning out a storage unit that his uncle had maintained for years. When he heard about the investigation on the news, he contacted police about items he had found that seemed strange and out of place among his uncle's belongings. In the storage unit, investigators found evidence of the theft ring that Brian had been investigating, including stolen school equipment, forged documents, and records of online sales. But more importantly, they found a journal that Gary Fletcher had kept during the final months of his employment at the school. The journal entries painted a picture of increasing paranoia as Fletcher realized that someone was investigating his activities. His writing became more erratic as October 2003 approached, with references to that kid who won't mind his own business and concerns about having to do something before it's too late. The final entry, dated October 15, 2003, the day Brian disappeared, contained a confession that would finally bring closure to the case. Couldn't let him destroy everything. Kid wouldn't listen, wouldn't back off. Had to make it look like he just ran away. Told him I had information about the missing equipment. Needed to meet him at the old maintenance shed by Miller's Woods. When he got there, I was waiting. Didn't mean for it to happen, but he said he was going to the police the next day. Couldn't let that happen. Couldn't go to prison. Buried him where no one will ever find him. Hidden his things to make it look like he left on his own. God forgive me. The maintenance shed Fletcher referenced had been demolished in 2010 as part of a Parks Department renovation, but ground-penetrating radar and careful examination of county records helped investigators identify the location. On June 15, 2021, 8 months after the discovery in the locker, Brian Mercer's remains were finally recovered from a wooded area that had been searched multiple times 18 years earlier. The news of Brian's death devastated the community that had never stopped hoping for his safe return. Susan Mercer, who had dedicated her life to helping other families of missing persons, faced the reality that her son would never come home. At the press conference announcing the discovery, she stood with quiet dignity as Chief Hawkins delivered the news she had dreaded for 18 years. "While this is not the outcome we prayed for," she said through tears, "we finally have answers. We finally know what happened to our beautiful boy, and we know that Brian died trying to do the right thing, trying to protect his school and community from a criminal who was stealing from the very people he was supposed to serve." David Mercer, who had spent years and countless dollars searching for his son, released a statement from Arizona. Brian always stood up for what was right. He saw injustice and couldn't ignore it, even when it put him in danger. "I'm proud of the man he was becoming, even though we'll never get to see the man he would have been." Coach Tom Reynolds, whose discovery in the locker room had finally broken the case, struggled with complex emotions. The answers he had sought for so long brought relief, but also profound sadness for opportunities lost and potential unfulfilled. Brian Mercer was going to change the world, Reynolds said at his former players' memorial service. He was going to make a difference, help people, stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. In a way, he did all of those things. His courage in investigating those thefts shows the character we all knew he had. His death was senseless and tragic, but his life, even cut short, had meaning and purpose. The football field at the new Fairview High School was renamed the Brian Mercer Memorial Field, with a bronze plaque commemorating not just his athletic achievements, but his courage in standing up to corruption. The scholarship fund that Coach Reynolds had established grew into a substantial endowment, helping dozens of student athletes pursue their educational dreams. Gary Fletcher's theft ring had indeed been extensive, investigators discovered. Over several years, he had stolen more than $75,000 worth of equipment and supplies from the school district, money that could have funded programs and resources for students. His crimes had not only cost him his life through the stress and guilt they generated, but had also robbed a promising young man of his future. The case officially closed on December 15, 2021, 18 years and 2 months after Brian Mercer had walked into the Fairview High School locker room for the last time. Detective Lisa Park, who had devoted 8 years of her career to finding answers, felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness as she filed the final reports. Brian Mercer was a hero, she reflected. He saw something wrong and tried to fix it, even knowing it was dangerous. His investigation was more thorough than some professional inquiries I've seen. If he had lived, I think he would have made an excellent police officer or FBI agent. For the town of Fairview, Brian's death marked the end of an 18-year period of uncertainty and fear. Parents could finally tell their children the truth about what had happened, and the community could begin to heal from the trauma that had defined them for so long. The old high school building was finally demolished in early 2022, its destruction marking the end of an era that had been defined by both triumph and tragedy. As the wrecking ball swung through the walls that had witnessed Brian Mercer's final moments, many community members gathered to watch in silence, finding a strange sense of closure in seeing the building that had harbored such painful secrets finally reduced to rubble. In the months that followed, Fairview began to rebuild, not just the physical structures, but the sense of community that had been fractured by 18 years of unanswered questions. The new high school, built on a different site with modern security features and open architectural design, represented a fresh start for a town that had lived too long in the shadow of mystery. Susan Mercer returned to Fairview for the first time in over a decade to attend the dedication of the Brian Mercer Memorial Field. Standing on the pristine artificial turf where young athletes would chase their dreams, she felt a bittersweet peace, knowing that her son's legacy would inspire future generations. Brian would have loved this, she said, watching the current Eagles team run through their drills under the bright Friday night lights. He would have been so proud to know that his story, difficult as it is, might help other young people understand the importance of doing what's right, even when it's scary. Detective Lisa Park was promoted to Chief of Detectives following the successful resolution of the case, becoming a national expert on cold case investigations. She often spoke at law enforcement conferences about the importance of never giving up, of continuing to look at evidence from new angles, and of the crucial role that community members could play in solving crimes. The Brian Mercer case taught me that truth has a way of surfacing, even when it's been buried for decades, she would tell audiences. It took 18 years, but justice was finally served. Not the kind of justice that brings a loved one home, but the kind that provides answers and prevents similar tragedies from remaining unsolved. Coach Reynolds became something of a reluctant hero. praised for his persistence in returning to face painful memories and his keen observation skills in noticing the anomaly in Brian's locker. He established a foundation focused on school safety and the importance of proper background checks for all personnel working with children. "I failed to protect Brian when it mattered most," Reynolds often said, "but maybe by sharing his story and working to make schools safer, we can protect other kids from similar fates." The case had ripple effects throughout the educational community. School districts across the country implemented new protocols for employee screening, inventory management, and student safety. The Brian Mercer Protocol became shorthand for comprehensive background investigations that looked not just at criminal history, but at financial troubles and other factors that might motivate criminal behavior. Marcus Williams, now a successful educator himself, incorporated Brian's story into his leadership philosophy. "Brian taught me that being a good friend means more than just having fun together," he would tell his students. "Sometimes it means making the hard choice to do what's right, even when it's dangerous or unpopular." The memorial services held for Brian in 2021 drew hundreds of people, many of whom had never met him but had been touched by his story. The teenager who had disappeared at 16 had become a symbol of courage and integrity, his investigation into corruption demonstrating a maturity and moral compass that impressed even seasoned law enforcement professionals. Sarah Chen, who had become a trauma counselor partly because of her experience with Brian's disappearance, spoke at the memorial about the lasting impact of his character. "Brian was the kind of person who made you want to be better," she said. "His friendship made me more confident, more willing to stand up for what I believed in. Even in death, he's still teaching us important lessons about courage and doing the right thing." The resolution of Brian's case brought closure not just to Fairview, but to the families of Tyler Jameson, Kevin Shaw, and Danny Costello, the other teenage boys who had disappeared in similar circumstances. While their cases remained officially unsolved, the discovery that Brian's death was connected to his investigation into corruption rather than the work of a serial killer allowed their families to refocus their search efforts on more local possibilities. As 2022 progressed, Fairview began to experience something it hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades: growth. Young families started moving to the community, attracted by the new school facilities, the affordable housing, and the sense that this was a place where people looked out for each other. The dark chapter that had begun with Brian's disappearance was finally closing, allowing the town to write new stories of hope and community. Chief Ray Hawkins, nearing retirement, often reflected on the case that had defined his career. "Brian Mercer made me a better police officer," he would say. "He reminded me that every missing person is somebody's child, somebody's hope for the future. We owed it to him and his family to never stop looking for answers, and I'm grateful we were finally able to give them some peace." On October 15, 2024, the 21st anniversary of Brian's disappearance, Fairview held its first annual Brian Mercer Courage Award ceremony, recognizing young people who had demonstrated exceptional bravery in standing up for what's right. The first recipient was a high school sophomore who had reported a teacher for inappropriate behavior, showing the same kind of moral courage that had ultimately cost Brian his life. As the ceremony concluded and the community gathered for a candlelight vigil at the memorial field, there was a sense that Brian's story had finally found its proper ending. Not the ending anyone would have chosen, not the happy reunion, the college graduation, the wedding, the grandchildren that should have been, but an ending that honored his memory, celebrated his courage, and ensured that his sacrifice would continue to inspire others to do the right thing, even when it's difficult. Susan Mercer, now a grandmother to her daughter's children, stood holding her youngest grandchild as the candles flickered in the evening breeze. "Uncle Brian would have loved you," she whispered to the sleeping baby. "He would have taught you to be brave, to stand up for people who need help, to never ignore injustice just because it's easier." As the vigil ended and the community began to disperse, there was a palpable sense that Fairview had finally made peace with its past. Brian Mercer would always be remembered, not as the boy who disappeared, but as the young man who had died trying to protect his community. His story would continue to be told, his courage would continue to inspire, and his memory would ensure that future generations understood the true meaning of integrity. The empty locker that had haunted Coach Reynolds' dreams for 18 years now existed only in memory, demolished along with the building that had contained it. But the courage it had hidden, the truth it had preserved, and the justice it had finally delivered would endure forever in the hearts of all who knew Brian's story. In the end, that was perhaps the most fitting memorial of all, not a building or a plaque, but a living legacy of courage that would inspire others to stand up for what's right, no matter the personal cost. Brian Mercer had wanted to make a difference in the world, and though his life was cut tragically short, his impact would ripple through generations, proving that sometimes the smallest actions can have the most profound consequences. The mystery was solved, the truth was known, and Brian Mercer could finally rest in peace, knowing that his courage had not been in vain and his memory would live on in the community he had died trying to protect.